The envelope sat unopened on the silver tray in the front hall of Laurel House, the way envelopes addressed to Cecily Vane always sat, a little too deliberately, the corner aligned with the tray's edge with the precision of a woman who wanted everything in her world to signal care. Daniel had placed it there herself that morning, having collected it from the letterbox at 7:30, having noticed the crest on the back, having set it down without reading it, because that was not her place, and never had been. She was arranging the hothouse flowers in the sitting room when Cecily came downstairs, 9:02, in the peacock silk dressing gown she wore for mornings, when she felt powerful. "The post," Daniel said. Just that. Cecily didn't look at her. She took the envelope from the tray as though Daniel had not spoken, slit it open with the letter knife she kept in her left dressing gown pocket the way other women kept lipstick, and read the card inside in silence. Then she smiled, which was the thing Daniel had learned over 3 years to treat as weather. "We've been invited to the Ashmore harvest dinner," Cecily said, folding the card once with great precision and tucking it into her pocket alongside the knife. "You'll come, of course. I'll need someone to manage the car, the bags, the evening." She was already turning toward the stairs. "And try to look like you belong somewhere, Daniel. At Ashmore one meets a particular kind of person." She was gone before Daniel could answer, which was the usual arrangement. Daniel stood with a stem of late-blooming larkspur in each hand, looking at the doorway where Cecily had been, and thought about the word belong. She had worked at Laurel House for 3 years. She had organised Cecily's correspondence, arranged her social calendar, sourced her husband's former library for the authors Cecily wanted to seem to have read, managed the kitchen accounts, supervised the 2 daily women who came to clean, driven Cecily to London for medical appointments she called cultural visits, and sat outside in the car for 3 hours while Cecily lunched with people who would not have found Daniel's name memorable by the following morning. She had done all of this without complaint and without much thanks, which she had known was the condition of the work from the first week. She did not think of herself as belonging at Laurel House exactly. She thought of herself as useful there, which was a different thing, and quieter. She put the larkspur in the vase on the windowsill where the October light would catch the blue of it, and went to find out what the rest of the day required. The Ashmore estate sat 12 miles northeast of the village, at the end of a lane the county kept repaired, because the family had kept the county grateful for long enough that the lane's condition was now simply assumed. Daniel had driven past the turning twice in 3 years without going up it, which was not unusual. The family was not the sort that appeared at local fêtes or turned up at the church roof appeal cake sales. They were the sort that sent a substantial check by post and did not require acknowledgement. What Cecily said about them, specifically about the heir, was a different register of information altogether. She had said it at a dinner the previous spring over the asparagus to a woman named Patricia Holt, whose husband had recently retired from the county planning committee. She had said that the heir to Ashmore was not what one hoped for in a man of that position, that he had been difficult with the tenants, cold with the village businesses, that there was a manner to him that made people feel less rather than more. She had said this with the casual authority of someone who had traded in county gossip, long enough that repetition had the weight of fact. Daniel had been refilling the water glasses at the time. She had not been invited to the table, which was standard. She had heard the conversation the way she heard most of what went on in that house, because she was quiet, and because people who held a certain kind of social power had stopped registering the presence of people who served them. She had not thought much about the heir to Ashmore before that evening. After it, she thought about him the way you think about a steep road someone has told you is icy, with a kind of preparatory caution, an awareness that came from someone else's experience rather than your own. The preparations for the harvest dinner took Cecily 4 days, and used Daniel as their primary instrument. There were calls to Cecily's dressmaker in town. There was the question of the pearls versus the garnets. There was a particular pair of shoes that needed to come back from the cobbler and didn't, which produced an hour on the morning of the third day that Daniel moved through carefully, the way you move through a room where something fragile has already fallen. She collected the shoes herself, drove to the cobbler, waited, brought them back. Cecily had already forgotten the hour by the time Daniel handed them over, which was also standard. On the evening itself, the drive up the lane to Ashmore took 8 minutes. The house appeared at a bend in the road, stone-faced and warm-windowed, lit from inside by what looked like candlelight, and might have been the old wing fronting directly onto a gravel sweep where other cars were already arranged with the careful spacing of people who had parked in front of houses like this before. Daniel handed the car to a young man in a dark coat, collected Cecily's small evening bag and her own, and followed Cecily through the front door into a wide entrance hall that smelled of beeswax and late-season chrysanthemums, and, underneath both of those, wood smoke from somewhere deeper in the house. There were 14 places set in the dining room, which she counted when she was asked to help settle the seating arrangement by an older woman named Mrs. Parrish, who appeared to be managing the practical logistics of the evening with the calm of someone who had done it many times. 14 places, a long table set with cream linen and heavy silver that had gone dark at the handles from long use. The candles were real. The chrysanthemums from the hall had migrated to the table's centre in a low arrangement that didn't block sightlines, and this small practical intelligence made Daniel notice it specifically, the way she noticed small practical intelligences wherever they appeared. Cecily was already across the room, finding a woman named Lady Fenwick, whose family she had known for 30 years, and whose company she sought with the focused attention of a person who understood that proximity to the right name was its own currency. Daniel found her place card at the far end of the table next to a retired academic named Professor Heir, who was already seated and apparently asleep, and across from an empty chair whose card said, "Billy Ames," in a handwriting that was not Mrs. Parrish's. She sat, unfolded her napkin, and looked at the table. The wine arrived before the first course, which was not unusual at this kind of dinner. What was unusual was the wine steward. He was not in the particular livery of the household, which ran to dark jackets and cream waistcoats on the men. He was in something simpler, a plain dark shirt, dark trousers, no emblem or badge, with the kind of collar turned back the way someone turns a collar back when they want nothing at their throat. He carried the first bottle the way someone carries a bottle they know, not performing the hold, not showing it off, and he moved along the table with a particular economy, filling glasses from the right, stepping back after each, not waiting to be thanked, and not apparently bothered by the absence of it. He reached Daniel's end of the table last, which gave her time to watch him, which she did without particular intention. He was, she thought, not much older than 35. His hair was dark and had not been managed into anything deliberate. His hands were steady. He poured her glass with the same attention he'd given every other glass, and she looked up. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, which was not what she expected. Most people at the table had not looked at him at all. He met her eyes for a moment, and then he nodded, once, the small, particular nod of someone who has received a thing they were not expecting. She looked back at her menu card, and he moved on, and that was all. The first course was a soup, a pale, clear broth, with something fragrant in it that she couldn't name and spent some time trying to, until Professor Hale surfaced from whatever he'd been doing and turned out to be pleasant company after all, with strong views about local history and a willingness to share them without requiring anything in return. The wine steward came back. He refilled the professor's glass and then hers, and this time Cecily at the far end looked up, and said something to Lady Fenwick that made them both laugh, and the sound travelled down the table, the way sounds in long rooms always travel, arriving transformed. The woman to Daniel's left, W. Ames, who turned out to be a Winifred, a retired magistrate with a direct manner and one hearing aid she adjusted frequently, leaned toward her and said, "Do you know who does this every year? The wine service. I never know who to credit." "I don't know," Daniel said. "The estate, I suppose." "The estate," Winifred agreed with a slightly sceptical inflection that suggested she had opinions about estates in general and their staffing in particular, but was too well-mannered to share them at a dinner table. The second course came. The main, which was a roasted bird of some kind over a grain Daniel identified as farro after the first bite, arrived next. The steward circulated twice during the main course, and the second time he reached Daniel's place she noticed that he chose her glass over the professor's, though both were equally low, and poured hers first, which was not the protocol she would have expected. She didn't remark on it. She thanked him again. "The Barolo," he said quietly, without anyone else apparently hearing. "It's better than the Burgundy they'll pour next, in case you wanted to know." She considered this. "Is that a recommendation or a warning?" He looked as though he was thinking about the difference. "A preference," he said. "I'll remember that." He moved on. Winifred, who had caught the last two words only, raised an eyebrow at Daniel with mild theatrical interest, and Daniel looked at her plate. Cecily's voice came again from the far end, over a small collective laugh. Daniel heard her name in it, or something shaped like her name, and then the conversation moved on before she could reconstruct the sentence. The dinner continued the way long, formal dinners do, in two channels. The official one, public and social, performed across the full length of the table, and the unofficial one, which lived in the small exchanges between immediate neighbours. The steward was part of neither channel, and moved between them both without belonging to either. He came back once more before the dessert course, and this time he stopped a moment longer at Daniel's end, not at her glass, which was still half full, but at the professor's. And while he poured, he said, without turning to her, "Were you in the county last winter?" "I was," she said. "There was a lecture at the village hall, local land history." "I went to that." He did turn then, briefly. "I know," he said. And he moved on again before she could answer, back up the table toward the other end where the conversation was louder and the candles had burned lower in their holders. She held that information very still. She turned it over once, put it down, and thought about what it meant that a wine steward at a private estate dinner had been at a public lecture in the village hall on a Tuesday evening in January, recognized her, and waited until now to mention it. It didn't add up to anything she could name. She ate her dessert, which was a poached pear with something dark underneath it, and she listened to Professor Hale explain the particular significance of the field system north of the village. And she did not think about it, except that she did, steadily, in the way you think about an object in the corner of a room that is almost certainly only a coat on a hook, but whose shape you keep returning to anyway. The moment came through a gap in the conversation at her end of the table. Winifred had turned toward Professor Hale with a question about a particular historical map, and the noise from the upper end was momentarily low. And what came through to Daniel was Cecily's voice in the particular register she used when she thought she was only being heard by the people she chose. "She's very competent, I'll grant you that," Cecily was saying to someone, the voice of someone who has been asked a direct question and is answering it with the diplomatic version of a less diplomatic truth. But temporary. One never quite attaches in that kind of arrangement, does one? She came to me through an agency 3 years ago. She's good at what she does, and she understands her place, which matters more than people admit. A murmur from the unseen respondent. "Oh, one will find someone else," Cecily said. "These arrangements never last." and one doesn't particularly want them to. She's useful in the way a good diary is useful. You don't sentimentalize a diary. There was a small appreciative sound from whoever was listening, the social sound that means the speaker's audience is pleased with the speaker's wit. And then the conversation moved on again, back into the general current of the table. Daniel sat with her hands in her lap, very still. She did not look towards Cecily's end. She did not alter her expression because Winifred had finished with the professor and had turned back, and Winifred had very direct eyes and the habit of reading rooms that 30 years in a magistrate's court will produce in a person. "Are you all right?" Winifred asked, not unkindly. "Yes," Daniel said. "Thank you." Winifred looked at her for a moment longer, with the expression of a person who suspects that the literal answer and the true answer occupy different rooms, and then she let it go, which Daniel was grateful for. The useful thing about hearing something you were not meant to hear is that you cannot unhear it, but you can decide what to do with it. Daniel had understood, at some level, that her position at Laurel House was not permanent in any deep sense. She had not been offered a contract beyond the initial agency terms, which renewed annually, but required nothing from either party except the agreement to continue for another year. She had understood this the way you understand weather, as a condition to plan around rather than fight. Hearing it stated plainly in someone else's mouth, to someone else, in the voice Cecily used for things she was certain of, was not the same as knowing it. It was a different thing, with a different texture, like the difference between reading that water is cold and putting your hand into it. She breathed out carefully. She picked up her water glass and set it down. She thought about 3 years of mornings at Laurel House, of letters collected and envelopes aligned and larkspur in October light, and she decided with the particular quiet of someone who has already made a decision without quite knowing it, that none of that meant she had been wrong to be decent to the people in front of her. It just meant Cecily had not seen it, which was Cecily's limitation, not hers. There was a clatter then from the far side of the serving door, audible to the whole table because the room had reached one of its between-course lulls. A young man came through the door quickly, 2 plates tilted in the collision with the door frame, a small ceramic dish completing its arc from the tray to the floor, with a specific crack of something that had been whole and was now not. He stood in the aperture of the door with the expression of someone who is 22 and has just broken something in front of 14 people, and is currently calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Daniel was up before she had decided to stand. She crossed the few feet between her chair and the door, with the naturalness of someone who has cleaned up broken things many times without fanfare, crouched and gathered the larger pieces of the dish in her napkin before they could migrate toward anyone's feet. The young man had set down the tray by then on the sideboard and was on his knees beside her, and she looked at him with a specific kind of directness, the kind that means, "This is manageable. Keep moving." "It's fine," she said, quietly enough that it wasn't a performance for the table. "Just clear the rest carefully." "I'm terribly sorry," he said, at a pitch intended for the whole room. "Don't apologize to the room," she said, same quiet register. "Apologize to Mrs. Parrish later specifically, and it will count for more." He blinked at her. Then he nodded, and she handed him the napkin with the pieces folded inside, and they both stood up, and the dinner resumed. She was aware as she settled back into her chair that the steward was watching her from the far side of the room, near the sideboard where he had set the next bottle. He was not pretending not to have seen. He was simply watching with the contained, levelled attention of someone to whom the thing they just witnessed was of particular interest. When she looked at him, he did not look away. She looked away instead because there was nowhere to put the warmth of being watched with that kind of attention that did not feel like too much. Here, now, in this room. Winifred's hand touched her arm briefly. Just briefly. She said nothing, and Daniel said nothing. And Professor Hale had found a new enthusiasm for the farrow grain's historical origins. And the dinner went on. The dessert wine arrived in small glasses. A golden late-harvest something that the steward poured with more ceremony than the red. The bottle held differently, tilted more slowly. And when he reached Daniel's glass, he set the bottle on the table beside her place, rather than removing it with him, which was not what he'd done for anyone else. "In case you want more," he said. It was the most words he'd said to her at once. She looked at the bottle, and at him and said, "That's not protocol, is it?" "No," he said with the first thing she could have called a smile, though it was small and lived mostly in the corners of his eyes rather than in his mouth. She left the bottle where it was. She did pour more later, when the conversation at her end of the table had deepened into comfortable territory, when Professor Hale had found in Winifred a more formidable interlocutor on the subject of medieval field boundaries than he had perhaps anticipated, and was visibly delighted by the challenge. She did not see where the steward went. He was there, and then he was elsewhere in the house, doing whatever the evening required, and she did not track his movements the way she might track something she wanted, because wanting things was a practice she had let herself get out of, gradually, over 3 years of Laurel House and the life that came with it. The guests began to move towards the drawing room when the dessert plates were cleared, which was the point at which Cecily detached from Lady Fenwick and made her way toward Daniel with the targeted movement of someone locating a useful tool. "Gerald Crane has arrived," she said without preamble. "He was delayed. You should have organized his car." "He wasn't on the list you gave me," Daniel said, which was true. Cecily looked at her with the expression that meant the logical correction had been heard and classified as irrelevant. "See if Mrs. Parrish needs help with the coffee service. You'll be more comfortable with something to do." She walked away toward a man with silver hair who was shaking hands with another man near the fireplace. Daniel watched her go, then looked at the room. Gerald Crane. She knew the name, Cecily's solicitor, who had handled the estate paperwork for some neighbouring property transaction 2 years ago. She had typed 3 letters to his firm. She had answered 2 telephone calls from his office in the summer and passed them on. He was a practical man in his 60s, silver-haired as she'd understood him, with reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket and a directness that came from 30 years of working with people who had things they wanted to protect. The drawing room was full. The steward was not in it, and then he was, near the drinks table at the far end, not pouring anything, apparently having come in for some other reason, holding a glass of water rather than wine. He looked, for the first time in the evening, like someone who was deciding something rather than waiting for the next thing. Cecily reached Gerald Crane at the fireplace. Daniel watched from near the drawing-room door because she was still deciding whether to find Mrs. Parrish. What happened next took about 30 seconds. Gerald Crane looked across the drawing room, and his face changed the way faces change when they see something they didn't expect to see in the place where they're looking. Not alarm, not confusion. Something more like a recalibration, fast and private, and then already social, the shift a practiced man makes when he realizes the situation requires him to be publicly precise. He moved across the drawing room with purpose. Cecily was saying something to him still, beside him, tracking his movement with the slight puzzlement of someone whose conversation partner is leaving mid-sentence. He stopped in front of the steward, which was where he had clearly been going. "Rowan Ashmore," he said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to formal rooms, the name landing in the particular way that two-part names land when they are spoken by someone who knows their exact weight. "I didn't realize you'd be in tonight. I thought you were in Edinburgh until Thursday." The room changed. It did not change loudly. It changed the way rooms change when a word is spoken that reorganizes the furniture of everyone's understanding simultaneously. A few conversations simply stopped. One started again, a little too quickly. The steward, who was not a steward, who had been pouring wine at this table since before the first course, who had told her the Barolo was better than the Burgundy, and left the bottle beside her glass, turned to face Gerald with a patience that suggested this was not the first time someone had announced him in a room he had hoped to move through unannounced. "Gerald," he said. That was all. His voice was level and without performance, and it contained, underneath the level surface, something that might have been amusement or might have been resignation, and was probably both. "I had no idea," Gerald said, looking around the room now with the slightly helpless expression of a man who has just realized his certainty about a situation was considerably premature. "You might have sent word." "I might have," said Rowan Ashmore with the same containment. Daniel stood near the drawing-room door and held very still. She went back through the evening in a single pass. The way you reread a document when you discover the word you thought you knew means something different in the original language. The lecture in January. The way he'd poured. The bottle left at her place. The particular quality of his attention when she'd helped the young server, the watching that was not casual but was not intrusive either, was careful, was interested, was the attention of someone who had been paying attention to something specific. "The heir to Ashmore was cruel," Cecily had said. At her own dinner table with her particular authority, to Patricia Holt over the asparagus. He had been pouring Daniel's wine. Cecily was standing 6 feet away from Gerald, and something was happening in her face that Daniel had not seen there before. It was not the face Cecily made when she was surprised. It was the face Cecily made when the ground had moved under something she had always been certain was fixed, and she was still deciding whether to acknowledge the movement or to perform that it hadn't occurred. "But you," Cecily said, addressing Rowan with the cadence of someone trying to reclaim a conversation they have lost. "You were in Edinburgh," Gerald said. "You were—" "I was here," Rowan said. "I'm often here. It's my house." The matter-of-fact simplicity of that sentence was devastating in a way no performance could have been. No irony. No cruelty. Simply the plain truth of a man who owns a house, delivered in a room that was now very quiet, in front of 14 people who were all doing rapid and private arithmetic. Cecily's composure, which was normally a formidable and load-bearing structure, developed what Daniel could only describe as a visible crack, not a collapse. "A crack," she said. "Of course, I knew that. One simply doesn't expect—" And then she did not finish the sentence because there was no version of it that worked, and she was too experienced to let a sentence she couldn't finish escape into the room. "Mrs. Vane," Rowan said, which was when Daniel understood he knew exactly who everyone at his table was, which meant he had known all evening. "I hope the evening has been comfortable." It was a host's sentence. It landed like one. Cecily heard it that way, visibly the syllables of Mrs. Vane doing in her a particular kind of rearranging that was painful to watch from a distance of 6 feet, and that Daniel nonetheless watched without looking away. "Perfectly," Cecily said with the discipline of 30 years in county society. "Quite perfectly." Gerald, who was not a cruel man but was an accurate one, chose this moment to turn away from Cecily toward Daniel, whom he placed after a moment's consideration that she could see happening behind his eyes. "You're Cecily's household manager," he said. "Mitchell. We've spoken on the telephone." "Yes," Daniel said. He studied her with the professional attentiveness of a man who has spent 30 years determining what people in rooms actually know versus what they appear to know. Then he glanced at Rowan, and something passed between them that Daniel was not part of, and did not try to read. The dinner was well organized, Gerald said to Daniel, and it was such a plain and specific sentence about such a plain and specific fact that she accepted it for what it was. Winifred materialized at her elbow with the timing of a woman who had been watching events and had decided the moment required a friendly shoulder near the right person. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her adjustable hearing aid and her magistrate's posture, and it was enough. The room redistributed. The conversations that had paused reformed, a little differently than before, with new alliances and revised assessments of where to stand and who to face. Cecily moved toward Lady Fenwick with a purpose that looked like social continuity and was clearly something else. A recalibration of her own, a retreat toward familiar ground. The gathering moved, thinned, resolved. An older couple made their farewells to the heir of the room rather than to any specific host, and Mrs. Parrish appeared with coats. The professor found Daniel near the door and pressed her hand with the warm abruptness of someone who has decided you are worth knowing and wants to register it before the opportunity passes. She was gathering Cecily's small evening bag and her own from the chair near the entrance hall when she heard him behind her. She turned. Rowan Ashmore was standing in the entrance hall, no longer carrying anything, in the same plain dark shirt with the collar turned back, which looked now exactly what it was. Not a uniform, not a disguise, just the clothes of a man in his own house who prefers not to be arranged. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't," Daniel said. And she meant it. He had not lied to her. He had simply not corrected an assumption she had brought into his house along with Cecily's evening bag and Cecily's understanding of the world. "I was in January," he said, which she understood to mean the lecture, the village hall, the Tuesday in winter. "I've been at most of them these past 3 years. Hale is a very good speaker." She thought about that. 3 years of lectures on local history that she had attended because they were interesting and cost nothing, and got her out of Laurel House on a Tuesday evening. He had been there. She had not seen him, or had not known what she was seeing. "Why the wine service?" she said. It was not quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Because if I sit at the head of the table, people perform," he said. "They say what they think the heir to Ashmore wants to hear. They tell me the same stories they told me last year. If I pour the wine, I find out what people are actually like." She thought about what people were like when they thought no one important was watching. She thought about Cecily's voice through a gap in the table noise. She thought about herself thanking a wine steward who hadn't expected to be thanked. "And," she said, he looked at her with that levelled, careful attention she now understood had been deliberate from the beginning. "And I found what I was looking for," he said, "as it happens." She wanted to ask what he meant by that, and she didn't, because she was standing in his entrance hall with his chrysanthemums perfuming the air and 14 people's worth of recalibration still settling around them both. And some things could wait for a space that was more her own than this. "I should get the car," she said. "You should come back," he said. "Thursday, if you're free. There's a walk I'd like to show you on the north edge of the estate. It comes out above the field system Hale is always talking about. You can see where the medieval boundaries were from the high point." She looked at him. The candles in the hall had burned further down than when they'd arrived, and the light was lower now and warmer. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She went to collect the car. She drove Cecily the 12 miles back to Laurel House in a silence that Cecily filled only once, near the village, saying, "I may have had a slightly incomplete understanding of certain things about the Ashmore estate. in the tone of someone composing a sentence they have edited 17 times before speaking. Daniel did not respond to this because anything she said would not help, and silence would serve both of them better. She pulled into the drive at Laurel House, and Cecily got out, and Daniel sat for a moment in the car in the dark before going in, with her hands on the wheel and the engine cooling, and the sound of October around the house. The dry, particular sound of leaves that have let go and are not yet down. She thought about a bottle left at her place and a seat at a table, and a man who poured wine in his own house because it was the only way to find out whether the people he invited were who they appeared to be. She thought about 3 years of larkspur in windowsills and letters laid on silver trays, and she thought that none of it had been wasted exactly, that it had been happening in front of the right witness all along, even when she had not known she was being watched. She thought about Thursday. Inside Laurel House, the lights in the upper hall went on one by one. She watched them from the car, through the old glass of the windscreen, then gathered herself and went in. The notice came 2 weeks later. Not from an agency, not from a solicitor's letter, not from any of the instruments Cecily usually employed when she wanted to make a change without appearing to make a decision. It came from Cecily herself at breakfast on a Thursday morning, which was the first Thursday since the Ashmore dinner, and Daniel recognized the timing without surprise. "I'm making some adjustments to the household," Cecily said, over toast she had not touched. "I want you to stay through the month to help with the transition. After that, I'll manage with what I have." "Of course," Daniel said. She went upstairs to begin the work of the morning. Margaret, Cecily's daughter-in-law, who kept a small sitting room on the second floor and had been at Laurel House since her husband's death 4 years ago, found Daniel in the linen room at 10:30, with the particular footfall of someone who has been looking. Margaret was a compact and quiet woman who had never once used Daniel's presence in the house as a social instrument, who had twice brought her a cup of tea unprompted on difficult days, and who had the quality of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. "I heard," Margaret said simply. "It's all right," Daniel said. "I know it is," Margaret said. "I only wanted you to know that I heard." She stood in the doorway of the linen room for a moment longer, and Daniel thought that there was a particular kind of witness that was not the kind that changes rooms or rewrites social orders, but was the kind that simply makes sure you know you are not invisible. "Thank you, Margaret," she said, and she meant it to reach the full depth of what it was meant to cover. Thursday arrived as it does, without ceremony or hesitation. Daniel drove herself out to Ashmore in the morning, in the small car she used for her own purposes, which was not Cecily's car and carried no one's social meaning. She turned up the lane and the house appeared again at the bend, the same stone face, the same warm windows. But the gravel sweep was only hers this morning, and the air was clear and cold, and carried the faint mineral smell of the November ground after rain. Rowan was waiting at the side of the house, near a wooden gate in the old stone wall, in a coat that was as unpretentious as the dark shirt had been, his hands in his pockets. He had 2 sets of boots with him, one of which was already at the gate and had been placed there with some consideration of size, which she noted without comment. They walked out onto the north edge of the estate in the early morning light, which was the colour of iron and clean, through the fields where the harvest was 2 weeks finished, and the ground had gone soft under the week's rain. He knew the names of the field boundaries. He knew where the medieval parish line had run and why it had been moved in the 17th century and what the evidence was. He talked the way Professor Heir talked, which was to say, with the enthusiasm of someone who is used to knowing a thing alone and is genuinely pleased to find another person interested. She listened and asked questions, and noticed that he answered questions the way he'd poured wine, with attention and without performance. They came out above the field system at the high point he had described, And he was right. You could see it from up here, the long, shallow ridge that had been a boundary when the monastery held the land. The curve of it still visible in how the field shapes bent around it. The landscape holding the record of itself, even after 5 centuries of forgetting. She stood at the top of the rise and looked out over the estate and the fields beyond it, and the village's rooftops in the middle distance. And she thought about what it meant to stand somewhere and simply belong there. Not by announcement, not by performance, but because it was where you were and you were genuinely, quietly, glad to be in that specific place at that specific moment. He was standing beside her, his shoulder near hers, looking at the same view. "The Barolo was better," she said. "You were right." He looked at her. "I thought about it later," she said. "At the end of the evening, I thought. He was right about the wine." He made the sound that she had decided was his version of a laugh, the one that lived in the corners of his face rather than in his voice. The view held. The iron light lay over the fields in long, cool lines. And somewhere below them, at the estate's edge, a bird called once and was quiet. And the morning went on around them, patient and broad and indifferent to every story that had brought them to this particular high point, and perfectly sufficient for what came next.